Think about the last time you felt truly seen. Not liked, not followed, not replied to. Seen. The last time someone looked at you and knew exactly what was happening inside you, without you having to explain it. Take a moment. Really think. For a lot of you, that memory is harder to find than it should be. And if that hit you in a way you weren't expecting, you're not broken. You're not weak. You're not doing life wrong. You are living through the loneliest moment in recorded human history. And the terrifying part? So is everyone else. Today we're going to talk about something the U.S. Surgeon General called a national emergency. Something the World Health Organization in 2025 linked to over 871,000 deaths every single year. Something that is quietly destroying every generation alive right now, in completely different ways, that nobody is connecting the dots on. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why your grandfather sat alone in that chair, why your parents never really talked to you about how they were feeling, why your friends seem busy but somehow never available, and why you, surrounded by more connection than any human being in history, might feel more alone than any generation that came before you. This is the loneliness epidemic, and it didn't start with your phone. Let me give you some numbers first, because this is bigger than most people realize. More than half of Americans, 57%, are lonely right now. Not occasionally, not just on bad days. Chronically, measurably, scientifically lonely. 1 in 5 adults feels lonely every single day, and nearly 3 in 5 Americans say no one truly knows them. Read that again. 3 in 5 people walking around right now, going to work, scrolling their feeds, texting their friends, feel that no one in their life truly knows who they are. And this isn't just emotional pain. Social isolation is associated with a 50% increased risk of dementia, a 29% increased risk of heart disease, and a 32% increased risk of stroke. The Surgeon General said it plainly. Lacking social connection carries health risks equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. You wouldn't hand someone a pack of cigarettes every morning. But we have built an entire civilization that does the emotional equivalent every single day to every single generation, and we've barely noticed. To understand how we got here, we have to go back, because loneliness didn't start with Instagram. It started long before any of us were born. The silent generation, those born between 1928 and 1945, experienced loneliness as a survival strategy. They came of age during the Great Depression and World War II. In that world, vulnerability was dangerous. Showing that you were struggling meant you were weak, and weak people didn't make it. So they built walls, not out of coldness, out of necessity. They had tight-knit communities on the surface, the church, the union, the neighborhood. But inside those communities, nobody talked about how they actually felt. You showed up, you worked, you endured. And when the war ended, and the men came home carrying things they could never name, they were handed a simple cultural instruction: move on. The loneliness of the silent generation wasn't the absence of people. It was the absence of permission to be human around those people. And that became the foundation everything else was built on. The baby boomers inherited that foundation, and then watched it slowly collapse. In the 1950s and 60s, community was still structural. You knew your neighbors. Your church had your name in it. Your union had your back. Your town felt like yours. But then something started shifting. Americans began leaving civic groups, unions, and churches. They had fewer close friends. They became less trusting of each other, less likely to gather in a local bar or coffee shop. The boomers didn't choose this. The economy changed. The suburbs sprawled. The car replaced the sidewalk. The television replaced the front porch. People started disappearing into private lives. And the boomers, raised to be stoic, raised to not complain, watched their communities dissolve and told themselves the same thing their parents told them: keep going, you're fine. By 2023, just under half of Americans belong to a religious congregation, the lowest Gallup has recorded since they began tracking the trend in 1937. The institutions that once held loneliness at bay, one by one, quietly went dark. And then came Generation X, the latchkey generation. These were children who came home to empty houses, not because their parents didn't love them, but because the economy had shifted enough that 2 incomes were no longer optional. For the first time in American history, childhood itself became a largely unsupervised experience. Gen X learned to be alone before they were ready to be alone. They learned that needing someone and that someone not being there was just normal. That emotional self-sufficiency wasn't a choice. It was a coping mechanism. And when they grew up and found their own version of community, it was always slightly held at arm's length. The Gen X philosophy of connection became, I want you in my life, but I don't need you. Because needing people had already disappointed them once. That wasn't cynicism. That was an entire generation protecting the same wound, in the only language they had been taught. And then the internet arrived. And for a moment, a beautiful, brief moment, it felt like the loneliness epidemic was over. You could talk to anyone, find your people, build a community anywhere on Earth. Millennials were the first generation to grow up with this promise, and they believed it. They built MySpace profiles. They added 800 Facebook friends. They posted their lives and waited for the world to respond. And the world did respond. With likes, with follows, with comments. But here is the thing nobody warned them about. Research has consistently shown that those in the upper 25% of social media usage frequency are more than twice as likely to experience loneliness. More connection, more loneliness. How is that possible? Because what social media gave millennials was the appearance of intimacy, without the substance of it. You could have 1,000 people watching your life, and not one person who actually knew you. 65% of lonely people say they feel fundamentally separate or disconnected from others or the world. 57% say they are unable to share what is really happening inside them. That is not a technology problem. That is a depth problem. And no algorithm in history has ever been able to manufacture depth. Which brings us to Generation Z, the first generation that never knew a world without social media. You'd think, having grown up native to digital connection, they'd be the least lonely generation in history. Researchers found that Gen Z and millennials are more lonely than Gen X and baby boomers, even though they are far more technologically connected. Gen Z is the loneliest generation ever measured. Young adults aged 18 to 34 report the highest levels of loneliness across all age groups, driven by a perfect storm of delayed life milestones, economic pressure forcing constant moves, social comparison through curated feeds, and anxiety about in-person interaction that makes real connection feel increasingly daunting. Think about that for a second. The generation with the most tools for connection is the most disconnected, because they were handed a world where you could be surrounded by noise, constant noise, and still go to sleep at night with that quiet ache of feeling unseen. Gen Z didn't create this. They inherited 80 years of increasingly fractured connection, and were handed a phone and told to figure it out. Here is what every generation has in common. The silent generation was lonely because showing emotion was dangerous. Boomers were lonely because their communities were quietly dismantled around them. Gen X was lonely because they came home to empty houses. Millennials were lonely because they were sold a digital substitute for real connection. Gen Z is lonely because they inherited all of the above and had nowhere left to go. The forces driving disconnection, financial pressure, screen addiction, remote work, and fractured communities haven't eased. If anything, they've deepened. This is not a personal failure. This is a historical accumulation. Every generation added another brick to a wall that now separates all of us from each other. And the wall has been building so slowly, over so many decades, that we've started to think the wall is just how things are. It isn't. In 2026, researchers are observing something they're calling friction maxing, a deliberate rejection of the frictionless digital life in favor of real-world connection. People are actively seeking out in-person classes, community events, analog hobbies, as a reaction to years of digital convenience that left them stimulated but profoundly disconnected. Something is waking up. People are starting to remember what it felt like to be in a room with someone. Really in a room. Not half present, phone face down, waiting for the next notification. The loneliness epidemic is not inevitable, but solving it starts with the thing every generation forgot how to do: admitting you feel it. Your grandfather who sat alone in that chair. He wasn't choosing isolation. He was surviving the only way he'd been taught. Your parents who never really opened up. They weren't withholding love. They were protecting themselves from a vulnerability their own parents had taught them was weakness. Your friends who seem busy but never available. They're not avoiding you. They're drowning in the same current you are. And nobody gave any of you the language to say, "I'm lonely." Are you? That's it. That's the whole thing. 3 words that every generation for the last 80 years has been too afraid to say out loud. Because somewhere along the line, we learned that being lonely meant being unlovable. And so we hid it. And the hiding made it worse. And the worse it got, the more we hid. The loneliness epidemic isn't a technology problem. It isn't a generational failure. It's what happens when human beings spend decades being taught that their most fundamental need, to be truly known by another person, is something to be ashamed of. You don't have to fix all of it today, but you can say it. I want to try something. In the comments right now, just write one word. The word that describes how you actually feel underneath everything when you're honest with yourself. One word. That's all. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to justify it. Just say it. Because the loneliest thing in the world isn't being alone. It's being in a room full of people who are all pretending they're fine, when none of them are. The next video in this series, we're going to talk about the generation that nobody discusses. The one that got completely skipped over in every conversation about boomers and Gen Z. The one that might be the most quietly wounded of all. I'll see you there.